Well, the main demand, of course, is equal rights. Equal rights to have a job, to have respect, to not be viewed as a piece of meat. Equal rights to set forth our own humanity. Equal rights to get into graduate programs, to get into schools, to training programs. We're the bottom third of the employment in terms of pay. We represent, nonetheless, 34% of the workforce, yet we're the first.
The fight for equality is not a new one. Women have been fighting for their absolute rights for centuries. The ever-evolving idea of feminism has been a notion since 1700s. Back then, of course, the simple idea of men and women to have equality was an idea of rebellion, and only came from radical activists as they were seen as such back then. The first recorded activist for the movement was the astounded author Mary Wollstonecraft, better known as the mother of Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft was born on April 27, 1759, in Spitalfields, London. She had grown up in an abusive home due to her father's alcoholism and her mother's cold behavior. Mary and her sisters fell victim to her father's rash and drunken behavior. Because of this, Mary felt obligated to surrender an early independence that was rightfully hers to care for her other family members. When her family moved around, Mary had met a girl 2 years older than her, Fanny Blood. Being able to read, write, sew, draw, paint, play piano, and more, Blood became the most influential female figure in Mary's life. After convincing her younger sister Eliza to run away from her abusive husband, Wollstonecraft and her sister had decided to move into a home with Fanny Blood. The three women even opened up a school for girls in order to spread this idea of independence. With this new page being turned in her life, Wollstonecraft envisioned a female utopia, hoping to keep herself financially stable and well off. Fanny Blood's plethora of talents had inspired Mary into realizing the full potential of a woman. Unfortunately, after a small time, Fanny Blood had died shortly after giving birth to her baby. Being heartbroken and devastated, Mary closes the girls' school and moves back to London to become a governess. After doing some domestic work for a period of time, she had learnt that wasn't her forte. With this thought in mind, Wollstonecraft had decided to take up what was seen as a radical profession at the time, an author. Her most notable work written was her astounded novel, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. In this novel, she had argued that women ought to have the same educational opportunities as their male counterparts. She also speculated that equality for both genders is a staple to a better world, and that women's minds are being undermined at this point in time. This novel had triggered a revolution and a beginning for what was seen as the feminist movement. Despite Wollstonecraft's novel being very rebellious and critiqued, it did build a momentum for women's rights. There were many restrictions on women's rights for owning property and voting. Many women did speak out about this oppression. One woman in particular was Elizabeth Stanton. Stanton was a women's rights activist, feminist, editor, and writer. During the Civil War, Stanton concentrated her efforts on abolishing slavery, but afterwards, she became even more outspoken in promoting women's suffrage. In 1848, Stanton, among others, sent out a call for a women's conference to be held at Seneca Falls. The announcement, published in the Seneca County Courier on July 14th, read, "A convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women will be held in the Wesleyan Chapel at Seneca Falls, New York, on Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and 20th of July current, commencing at 10 o'clock a.m. During the first day, the meeting will be exclusively for women, who are earnestly invited to attend. The public generally are invited to be present on the second day, when Lucretia Mott of Philadelphia and other ladies and gentlemen will address the convention." Over 300 women convened at the Wesleyan Chapel, and Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, a document that she had drafted over the previous few days. Stanton's declaration was modeled closely on the Declaration of Independence, and its preamble featured the proclamation, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." The Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances then detailed the injustices inflicted upon women in the United States and called upon U.S. women to organize and petition for their rights. On the second day of the convention, men were invited to attend, and some 40 did, including the infamous African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. That day, the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances was adopted and signed by the Assembly. For proclaiming a woman's right to vote, the Seneca Falls Convention was subjected to public ridicule. However, the resolution marked the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in America. Thereafter, national women's rights conventions were held annually, providing an important focus for the growing women's suffrage movement. In 1869, Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association with their eyes on a federal constitutional amendment that would grant women the right to vote. After years of struggle, the 19th Amendment was adopted in 1920, granting American women the constitutionally protected right to vote. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted American women the right to vote, a right known as women's suffrage, and was ratified on August 18th in 1920, ending almost a century of protest. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was certified by U.S. Secretary of State Banbridge Colby, and women finally achieved the long-sought right to vote throughout the United States. On November 2nd of that same year, more than 8 million women across the U.S. voted in elections for the first time. It took over 60 years for the remaining 12 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Mississippi was the last to do so on March 22, 1984. Even though the 19th Amendment was granted, the fight for equality was far from over.
How do you feel about women going on strike tomorrow for equal right?
I'm afraid I didn't even know that they were. Is it a nationwide strike or what? It is? Well, in that case, I imagine that I would pretty much agree.
How so? Do you feel that men discriminate against women?
I definitely do, especially in job opportunities. I, for one, have been discriminated against.
How?
I've had several job interviews where people have told me that if I were a man, I could have the job, but they don't want to risk that type of position on a woman. They feel that I'll leave.
Okay, thank you.
The second wave of feminism kicked off a few decades after the 19th Amendment in World War II. There were new ideas of equal rights for women through social standpoints. Some examples of those ideas were the push for equal pay, the right to abortion, birth control pills, and more. In 1963, writer and feminist Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, a nonfiction book in which she contested the post-World War II belief that it was the woman's destiny to marry and bear children.
We're all housewives when in the beginning and in the end.
Friedan's book was a bestseller and began to raise the consciousness of many women who agreed that homemaking in the suburbs sapped them of their individualism and left them unsatisfied. In 1966, Friedan had co-founded the National Organization for Women, formed and proceeded to set an agenda for the feminist movement. Framed by a statement of purpose written by Friedan, the agenda began by proclaiming now's a goal to make possible women's participation in all aspects of American life. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade affirmed a number of state laws under which abortions obtained during the first 3 months of pregnancy were legal. This made non-therapeutic abortion a legal medical procedure nationwide. This win had started one of the most stirred topics in America even today, the debate of the morals of abortions. The third wave of feminism begins in the 80s and lasts through the 90s even until the early 2000s. The fight for abortion was still going strong, like in the March for Women's Equality in 1989, gathering over 750,000 petitioners in D.C. Among abortion, the third wave of feminism focused on broadening diversity and embracing individualism. Main goals from this group appeared to be fighting against the violence of women, more reproductive rights, and overall embracing womanhood. Hundreds of rallies and marches spurred up across the country during these years, advocating and seeking change in the laws being made. This eventually led us into the modern-day feminist.
You know love has finally called for me.
We are a land of many colors, and we are singing for our lives. We are standing for our choices.
Today, feminism is still growing fast and building momentum for new goals and ideas. But rather than a group being held together by organizations and committees like in its past, it's instead being joined together by the growing social media and internet. We are seeing a staggering growth in the number of marches and rallies per year fighting for the causes that people are truly believing in. More recently, this spur of rallies and protests are said to be a response to Donald Trump taking office, along with other stories of women being put down just because of their sex. Specifically, feminism has been mostly about bringing attention to violence of women broadcasted in the hashtag #MeToo movement. There are still marches and rallies like there have been in the past decade. The most popular of these being the March for Our Women's Lives in 2004, gathered over 1.15 million people in Washington, D.C., promoting reproductive health care options like birth control and abortions. The word feminist has began to have a bad connotation in the past decade, but instead being confused with being a, quote, feminazi, coined by Rush Limbaugh. Overall, feminists still fight for basic equality between the sexes. Either way, the definition of a feminist remains the same: a person who believes of the social, political, and economic equality of men and women.
Equal rights to set forth our own humanity, equal rights to get into graduate programs, to get into schools, to training programs. We're the bottom third of the employment in terms of pay. We represent nonetheless 34% of the workforce, yet we're the first to be laid off and the last to be hired. There aren't frivolous demands at all. We just want what men have had all these years.